I'm confounded though. I mean, I have friends in the military. I have friends at the Pentagon. I have friends in NATO. I have, all in all manners. I have family members who were, in Iraq. So the amount of money that the United States spends to have this so-called greatest military in the world, President Biden just $800 billion, and Americans can't buy eggs. And you're pointing to this book, and I just don't know what the disconnect is. Like, where is this money going if it's not actually going to build up this massive military industrial force to be reckoned with, where we can't even fight one war, let alone a two-front war?
Well, it's the inherent corruption that's in Washington, D.C. Were you based in Washington, or were you up in New York?
I was in New York City, yeah.
So I first moved to the Washington, D.C. area in Maryland back in 1979. When I arrived there at the time, you did not have a single Lamborghini, Ferrari, Bentley dealership in the area. You didn't have a row of luxury stores, on par with what you'd see in Beverly Hills. Now it's populated. You can get a Ferrari, you can get a Lamborghini, you can get the high-end luxury items. Well, what does Washington, D.C. produce? Nothing but access to people who can allocate a lot of money for a lot of contractors. And the buildings that line the Dulles toll road going from Washington, D.C. out to Dulles Airport are just, it's contractor canyon. So what's happened is this corruption of money, where the defense industry buys off generals who come out of the Pentagon, and then they go onto their boards, and then they get their buddies, and then we're able to go back and sell weaponry. And I live next door to the largest defense lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And it was all about getting the right member of Congress member of Congress needs money for their campaign. So these corporations will spill out the money to them, and it becomes a self-licking ice cream cone. So instead of actually creating military hardware technology that's critical for national defense, it's really, you get the exotic. So we're now in a situation, and let's compare it back to World War II. What the Germans created, these massive tanks like the Panther. They were huge, but they took a long time to build. They were very complex mechanically, and once they got out into the field, they broke down. So yes, it was a big, huge tank, and it could destroy 10 Russian T-34 tanks. The difference, though, Russia was able to produce 1,000 T-34 tanks in a day. Think about that.
Wow.
So it was the difference between having all this high-end weaponry that it was not necessarily reliable, and let's call it low-end crap that actually worked and would keep on ticking even after getting a licking. And that's exactly the position the United States military is in today. Look at the F-35.
Right.
I forget, it cost, was it $90 million? And yet the flight, every hour it operates, you have to spend another $35,000 an hour to keep that plane in the air. So right away, you're talking about an enormous expenditure of resources for just one plane. The reality is we shouldn't have manned aircraft anymore that are combat fighters, because the drone technology has come so far that you can fly those planes remotely. And the second element is those planes can perform at levels that if they do not have a human occupant, they're much more, they can do a lot more dynamic activity. But because you have to have a human being in it, you've got to go through all these safety systems that end up adding to the cost of the plane. So we're in a situation in which we've invested so much money in military hardware that has been outpaced by technology. And I gave an example earlier, the hypersonic missile. Aircraft carriers no longer are invulnerable. They are very vulnerable, and 12 hypersonic missiles could take out the bulk of the U.S. naval force, and we can't build that carrier in a week. bringing on new carriers on board.
Wow.
All of a sudden, the United States military ability to project force through naval activity is eliminated. So this is the equivalent of the introduction of the machine gun back when we had horse cavalry. The horse cavalry became irrelevant. It was no longer relevant because the machine gun could kill it more quickly, and that's sort of a situation we're in now. We've invested so heavily in military equipment and hardware that candidly doesn't work that well, and they're actually seeing that a little bit on the field in Ukraine. We've sent thousands of Javelin missiles, and Stinger missiles, and they're not decimating the Russian military as often been claimed in the media.